Thank you. So we're going to discuss, this is a kind of a follow-up to the previous panel, but we're going to take the perspective for you of why is it so important that we have books in Objectivism, that we continue to write books in Objectivism, and what is the role of ARI in the context of writing books, And I can't help but read you a quote from Ayn Rand, and it's kind of cheating because my lecture tomorrow has the title of this article that Ayn Rand wrote, What One Can Do. So I won't read you the quote tomorrow, I'll read it to you now because it's directly relevant if this thing will work. And this is from kind of the middle of the article, and she's talking about what an individual can do. What is it? Because in the article, she purposefully rejects the idea of a movement because she says it's too soon. Right? And she talks about individuals. She says, I'm omitting the most important contribution to an intellectual movement, writing. And she says, because this discussion is addressed to men of every profession. That's why she's omitting it, because writing is a profession. And she very much identifies this as a profession. Books, essays, articles are movement's permanent fuel. But it is worse than futile to attempt to become a writer solely for the sake of a cause. Writing, like any other work, is a profession and must be approached as such. So books are the fuel, books, articles, and so on, written material, but primarily books, are fuel of anti-intellectual movement. Now, we have books. We have the most important books. We have Ayn Rand's books that articulate the philosophy that we all advocate and that we all believe in and that we all want to bring out into the world. But there is a lot more to say about this philosophy at the level of philosophy and at the level of its application. There are lots of things Ayn Rand did not apply the philosophy to that needs to be worked out. It's not self-evident how to apply Objectivism to the myriad phenomena in the world out there. And I'm not just talking about philosophy. There's philosophical phenomena, psychological, economic, and personal. Right? We heard a lecture this morning about selfishness. There's a lot of work to be done in ethics still. There's a lot of work to be done in epistemology, right? She wrote Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. It's just an introduction, which means there's still a ton of stuff that needs to be said and written and spoken and taught in epistemology. So there's still an enormous amount of work to be done to complete the project that is these ideas, and it's never going to be complete. There's always going to be more to be written. If you look at every intellectual movement in the past, from the Enlightenment to Marxism to environmentalism, at the core of all these movements are books and books and books, and then articles and op-eds and letters to editor, and books and books and books. It's written content behind all these intellectual movements. And we need a lot of it, and again, we need to apply it to many, many, many areas in life. Now, so we need books. Those of you out there who are aspiring intellectuals, aspiring philosophers, aspiring academics, we need books. We need to fill out both in the philosophy, but then also in the application. Now, I just want to say a word about ARI. Why ARI? And also here in the context of Movement 2.0. Two things about Movement 2.0. One is we're interested in a vibrant intellectual movement. We're interested in those of you who are interested in being intellectuals, going out there and being independent and becoming scholars or becoming intellectuals and writing. We're also interested in, from a perspective of Movement 2.0, in giving you visibility into what we do at ARI and why we do it and how we do it. And that's why we're doing panels like this to kind of explain some of the processes that we and the way we think about things internally at ARI. But let me just give you, and then I'll let these guys talk, just a perspective on book writing and the importance of, I think, bringing these books into ARI. Ayn Rand says in that little quote that writing is a profession, and it really is a profession. This is something that requires your full-time attention. This is something that requires incredible focus and incredible knowledge in order to write a book. Indeed, you can't really say you know a topic unless you either teach it or write it. When you teach it, you discover you don't know a bunch of stuff. When you write it, you suddenly discover you don't know a bunch of stuff, and you have to go and accumulate more research. To get to know a topic, to develop as an intellectual, you have to write. You have to write and write and write. It's the way we think, and it forces us to think more deeply about the issues. Now, today, in the world we live in today, there is no place on the planet to learn how to write qua objectivist. There's no place in the world where you can find editors who can edit a book as an objectivist book. Now, it would be great, and one day this will happen. There will be all kinds of academic centers and other centers, and there'll be other institutions in which objectivists are working and writing books and editing one another and teaching young intellectuals how to write and how to think about issues and problems and how to think about philosophy, but how to think in action. Because this is not just a classroom set. I mean, Don learned how to write in the OAC. I mean, he'll talk about this, I think. But then, how much did you learn to write after the OAC as part of just the process of writing and the editorial process that we engage in at ARI? It's immense. So it's crucial that there be an institution, whether it's ARI or anywhere else, where this is an activity that is engaged in by a group of intellectuals who are engaged with one another's work, who are helping one another, who are editing one another, stimulating one another, learning from one another, creating a mini community. There's that trigger word again. So that's what we aspire to be, right? That's what we aspire to be. And to some extent, some of our problem is we're too small of a community. As somebody said in the previous section, we need 100 of these writers at the Institute writing books, and a wide variety, again, of topics. But we also need other places, because we need academic books being written, like the books Tara Smith writes and like the companion to Ayn Rand. We need books in academic centers all over the country, and it would be great if the day comes where we have some of those academic centers that train and encourage the writing of books in philosophy and books on philosophy of science and a variety of other topics. All right. So with that, I'll pass it on to Don.
So I think you can divide it up in different ways, but you can put books on kind of two axes. One is, you might put it scholarly versus popular, and another you can put as theoretical versus application. And I think there's kind of two mistakes that I see a lot, and I've made them in various ways in the past, and I think is kind of interesting. So one is to view scholarly works that are really in-depth teaching about, say, objectivism, as failures if they don't reach a mass audience. And the second is to think that books that reach a mass audience aren't that important if they're on narrower issues of application. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of how I think about this, just from the perspective of looking back on my own development. So I discovered Ayn Rand through this kind of like self-help guru type guy, Robert Ringer, who wrote a bunch of books in the 70s and 80s, very influenced by Ayn Rand. And I read him when I was like 14 years old, and I was like, this is amazing. And then I saw, after I devoured his books, that he quoted this woman, Ayn Rand, a lot. So I bought hers, and I was like, well, now I need a better word, because amazing, this is genuinely amazing. That other guy was, didn't come close. But his books are what got me interested in ideas. They were really accessible, written, just to be, something that you could read by the beach one day. And then I became very interested in objectivism, and I turned to books like Dr. Peikoff's Objectivism and the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, later some of Tara Smith's works, a whole bunch of things that were much more focused not on reaching a wide audience and persuading them of objectivism, but here's for people who are very interested in the ideas, a much more select group, and want to know them in depth. And even today, there's a number of those works that are instrumental. I couldn't do what I do without them. Not a month goes by that I don't turn to Robert Mayhew's collections on essays on Ayn Rand's novels. And I think that it'll certainly be true with the new Blackwell Companion to Ayn Rand from Gregory Salmieri and Alan Godhelf, their edited collection. These things are crucial, and their value comes, though, not from them reaching a mass audience necessarily, but it's reaching a highly motivated audience, including people who are going to go on to write popular writings, who are going to go and be able to do a more effective job of reaching a wider audience, even though they're not going to go as much in depth on some of these issues. And one thing I have to confess to is when I was younger, and particularly, I'm studying books like Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, I had a certain contempt for books that were about application. I thought, if you're going to bother to write something that really matters. Philosophy, and not even philosophy, epistemology, and not even epistemology, but the most technical issues in concept formation. Like that's what really counts in life. And so, of course, I'd pick a career that involved writing popular stuff of application. But my old view, and I definitely have seen this with a number of objectivists, it's really, really wrong in at least two ways. One of the most striking things I ever read from Ayn Rand, and I believe this is an exact quote, but it could be a paraphrase, in The Art of Nonfiction, she says, "There's no such thing as objectivism." I thought, wow, that's a problem. But what she meant was that objectivism is a philosophy, and it's a philosophy which means it's a set of abstractions, but all that exists are concrete. The whole value of philosophy comes from your ability to deal with concrete issues. So if there weren't people out there writing, say, Tara Smith's latest book on judicial review, or people writing about here's how objectivism applies to fossil fuels, and here's how objectivism applies to all of these concrete issues that we have to deal with in life, then we're not actually getting the value of objectivism. It's for those concrete issues. And then the second thing is that you can think about it this way. How do people decide what tennis shoes they're going to wear or what diet they're going to do? Well, some people go and they do a bunch of research and what's the best study. A lot of people just go, hey, what's Michael Jordan wear? Hey, what does Arnold Schwarzenegger do for his workouts? They see success and then they want to know what's behind it. And if you can be really persuasive and effective, whether it's writing about inequality or being influential on, having an influential account of the financial crisis like John Allison, if people see that and they go, oh, that's really persuasive, then they have much higher incentive. Many people who might not go and read a book about objectivism just on its own, once they see that here's something I really respect that's really clarifying on a narrow issue, that's one of the best ways to be a salesman for the philosophy as a whole. So that's my justification for my job.
Who's next?
Elan. So I have just a couple of things I want to share with you, and part of the goal today is to sort of open the black box of what we do at the Institute, explaining our thinking behind our efforts, and to invite your questions, because we really want to share with you and convince you that we have definite views and the reasons for them. So the 2 points I want to bring out today are what we call our book-centric strategies. I want to define that for you, explain it, concretize it, and then I want to put that in a wider context of the movement, the objectivist movement, 2.0, beta, all the way back, and sort of what that means, but putting the movement itself in an even wider context of intellectual movements as such, and what do they look like, and how does it work? So, because I think it's important to see that what we're doing here has a certain kind of precedent, which is if you understand how ideas work, there's things to learn from how other movements and intellectual traditions operate. So let me start with the first point, what we do and why we call it book-centric. So as Yaron gave the quote from Ayn Rand, her view was that books and articles essentially are the permanent fuel of this kind of movement. And I think it's important to see it's books, substantive articles, courses. That if you think of Leonard Peikoff's courses, I mean, some of these are 30 hours of material, 20 hours of material, and really substantive. And if you think just how much, if you've taken them, I can say I've learned enormous amounts just from listening to those courses. Now they're available on ARI's website through ARI Campus to the whole globe. Now, to me, the book-centric is not the best label for what we're just talking about, because what we're really saying, and this is what we're really talking about is substantive content. And it happens to be that you package it in books and articles and courses and other ways and speeches and so forth. But capturing it as a book-centric approach, the one redeeming feature of that term is that it orients us towards the outcomes, towards the product. So we think of this as, we don't just sit around, write a book, and then on to the next book, and in between, well, maybe we should do something else. I want to give you an illustration of how this works. So we think of the book as, or the course, if you think of someone on a more academic track, as this is a core product that we develop. And it often takes more than a year. It's a lot of time, investment, and thought. And the core product is a means by which we deepen our knowledge, become better at communicating, and at the end of it, there's a really valuable product. But we don't just work on that. We work simultaneously on deriving shorter projects from it. So a chapter can become an article. From one article, you can make many op-eds. From one op-ed, I can make 3 or 4 talks. And the complexity of the ideas we're dealing with lend themselves to many, many spin-offs, op-eds, blog posts. All of these things are derivative products from the core products. If you want to think of it as we're generating this big cluster of value, and we break off pieces as we go, and then once the book comes out, we generate more content to promote it and bring it out. And so that's some of the mechanics of how we operate and how we try to be efficient and use our time well. I want to say a word about why, to sort of amplify some of what Yaron said about why it's important, and this connects to the second point. I want to let you in on a secret. So this is all about opening the black box. Here's the secret. Objectivism is hard, and practicing it is difficult. If you've heard Yaron's talk on this subject, it's on YouTube. Now, I'm being facetious, right? But objectivism is hard. And if you tried to sell it the way you might sell the iPhone, that would be great. I would love to get to the point where I could be the Steve Jobs. It's going to take time, just to warn you. But the reason it's hard to do is that it's a very challenging and radical perspective on the world that pushes back against not just the ideas we're taught, but it pushes back on things that are very personal, self-esteem, everything that we invest value in. Now, to make our views intelligible and convincing to people who come from a very different value context takes work. To make that perspective credible in nonfiction, in a course, in a talk, in a book, takes work. You need to elaborate. These are complex ideas. You establish them. And this is for a popular audience. I can't speak to an academic audience because the similar kind of challenges arise, but this is for sort of a general audience. Now, you need the space to do that in. An op-ed is not going to convince people. If you have 7 trillion op-eds from the Institute, that's not the point at which we win. I mean, it'll be great, but that's not what it takes to win. You need substantive content that people can chew, can argue with, can pick apart, can reference, can learn from it, to amplify Don's point. So to me, a part of why this is important, and it's central to our mission, is that we are charged with communicating and disseminating objectivism, and part of that means exhibiting its real-world value. And to do that, you need the space of at least a book, at least a lengthy article on an issue, one issue. It's not even the whole of the philosophy. It's just aspects of it applied and how it enriches human life and how it can bring peace and prosperity to all over the world. Now, there's so much value to convey, and you just need the space to do it. Now, that is a distinctive feature of objectivism because of it being a radical philosophy. It pushes against a lot of ideas. But it's also true that any credible movement, any movement that's achieved some measure of influence in its sphere of concern, this is what it takes. I mean, there's no shortcut, in effect. If you're going to reach the right kind of minds, the motivated people, it takes credible intellectual work, substantive work. And I want to give you one brief case study. And if you're interested, I can elaborate on it in the question period. I'm curious, how many of you have read or heard about the book the better angels of our character, I think. Steven Pinker. He's a psychologist, and he wrote a book about how violence has declined in the world. It's a fascinating book. It's a popular book. He's a psychologist, not a historian, and he admits this. But what's interesting to me about this book is that a central pillar of his argument can be traced back to a journal article from 1983 by a man called Michael Doyle that you would never have heard of unless you're interested in international relations. And even people in international relations, most of them know who he is because it's a seminal article. So Michael Doyle wrote an article about how democratic states are less warlike. Now you might have heard this. This is a view that Clinton advocated and George Bush made a whole policy based on it. It's not quite what Doyle said. Now what's significant to me is Pinker's book would not exist, and it was sold enormous amounts, and it influenced people's thinking about how violence declines both internationally and within a country. Now, that would not exist. The whole tradition of this line of thinking that Doyle animated in the 1980s, which goes under the name of democratic peace theory, which is essentially, well, if we look at these kinds of states, they're not dictatorial, there's some measure of freedom, and interestingly, they don't go to war with each other. Oh, okay, well, let's study that. There's a whole movement in academia that studies this, enormous literature. Now, you might not know about that because this is not your field, but it makes its way into the culture and it influences Clinton, Bush, and thousands of people who've read Pinker, whose book hinges on it. Now, ask me in the Q&A, where does Michael Doyle get his views from? I'll give it away now, because there's more to say in the Q&A. It is essentially a Kantian view. Michael Doyle is drawing a semi-obscure Kantian essay and reviving it and saying, well, we don't have to agree with everything Kant says, but there's really interesting things here about the way ideas work. And like if you look at society and governments, that's interesting. And it makes its way through intellectuals, and they move it forward. They teach it to students who become journalists, who become speechwriters, who whisper in Clinton's ear, and Clinton stands on stage and says, guess what? Democracies don't go to war with each other, which is not the original version of the theory, but it's an echo of it, and it's significant that it shaped American policy to such a degree that we went to war over this. So what I want to suggest is that this is a small-scale example of how an intellectual tradition in academia that most people won't have any reason to cross paths with has come to shape our culture in a very short span of time. How did that happen? Do you think that they sat around and sort of tweeted out, that it wasn't Twitter in 1980. They didn't tweet around, here's how it works. They wrote incredibly difficult articles and books. Michael Doyle wrote a book on his amplifying his articles. There's a lot of heavy intellectual work that went into it before it got to someone like Steven Pinker, who's non-expert in the field, who can concretize it and make it popular in the way that Don and Yaron, when they're writing about economics and when they're writing about inequality, they can bring philosophical ideas to a popular audience in a way that Pinker did this for that theory. So, I mean, if you think in the widest sense of how intellectual movements bring their message forward, it takes substantive content. And we think you package it efficiently through a book-centric approach. And I think it's critical for objectivism's growth because it's a way to bring people in. It shows that you have interesting things to say, that you can solve real problems. And what better way to exhibit the value of an abstract philosophy by showing in concrete form, wow, you can really answer these issues. You can really enlighten me. You can make my life better. You can solve social problems. You can explain what happiness is. So I'm going to hand it over to Steve to share his perspective.
All right, thanks. So I want to basically address two topics. The first is the importance of ARI. The second is I want to give you an example of a book. It's not even an objectivist book. This is outside of objectivism, but a book that has had a profound impact in its area. Because if we use it as an example, we can see how important books are. So let me start with the first one, which is the importance of ARI. I consider myself uniquely qualified to talk about this subject on this panel because I spent my entire career up to 3 years ago outside of ARI, certainly, but really not in the objectivist movement. I mean, I was been an objectivist for 20 years, but I didn't really, I was too busy, had my own career, working as a lawyer. And then I come to ARI, and you can imagine, successful career, cocky lawyer. What are these guys going to teach me? I mean, I could probably just want to, just leave me alone, and I'll go in my office and I'll write stuff. It didn't work out that way, right? I mean, it worked out that way in the sense that I now have the freedom to write. But I can say, honestly, I have learned more in the last 3 years about how to think clearly, and as a consequence, a far deeper understanding of all of the things that I was already considered myself an expert in because I've gotten to work at ARI. The 3 people I'm sitting with here, plus Onkar, Keith, and a number of others at ARI are some of the smartest and finest people I've ever worked with. And I can tell you I've worked with a lot of really smart people. It's absolutely invaluable to be able to rub shoulders with people like this, to be able to be in an environment where you can trade and bounce ideas off of people who understand not just the philosophy of objectivism, because I still have tons to learn about the philosophy, but what I really gained from working at this place and rubbing shoulders with these guys is my method of thinking became better. My clarity of thought became better by being constantly challenged, by being forced to really think through the ideas that I was trying to communicate, how I was communicating them, and being constantly challenged. I can remember writing a blog post about campaign finance once, and I used the word corruption in there, and Keith was editing it, and he said, "What the hell does that mean?" And I said, "Are you crazy? Everybody knows what this means. It's obvious what this means." And I stewed about it. He's crazy. This is stupid. What the hell is he saying to me? And I sat there for a while, and I realized, he's right. I don't have any idea what this means. I got to go figure out what this means. And I really spent a lot of time thinking that through. And what did that do? It forced me to rethink everything that I knew or thought I knew about campaign finance law, which got me into thinking about bribery, which got me thinking deeply about what is the root of bribery, should we even have bribery laws, right? And I really clarified my thinking. And so when I'm asked questions about these, I can give examples, I can give answers that trace these concepts that I thought I understood right back to reality. And I can put them in a way that nobody else puts them, right? I know because of my experience at this organization that I'm becoming a person who knows and has a deeper knowledge of the areas that I practice in than literally anybody else in the country. And it's because I've been, had this kind of training. I don't want to continue too long on this. It'll just turn into effusive, constant praise for these guys. But I mean, it's really, really important. Now, I'll just say another word about the topic. It's essential if you're going to produce intellectual content to be able to work in an organization that supports that intellectual content, that gives you the mental space to take the time to write drafts, to bounce them off of other people, just to get feedback on it. I mean, to have a place that I can go every day where I sit at my desk and I realize I don't have a gazillion things to do. I'm not going to have lawyers calling me on the phone. My job is to sit here, stare at a computer screen, and write. It gives, a kind of space that would be impossible to produce books, to produce the intellectual content without that kind of space. And I thank ARI and Yaron, who recruited me all those years ago, or he's been trying to get me to work there for a while, and all of the donors of ARI for giving me the ability to do that. Now, that kind of segues into the next topic, which is the importance of books. And I want to give you a concrete example. It's not within objectivism, but it's an excellent example of a book that, in a very short period of time, has had a profound impact on the laws, because this is my area, right? But that we can trace the impact both, in a sense, going forward and going back to other books. So if you really want to know the importance of books, this is a perfect example. So the book is a book called Reclaiming the Constitution, or the Lost Constitution, by a guy named Randy Barnett, who's a longtime libertarian thinker and has written on legal topics for a long time. His book is about judicial review. Now, I don't agree with everything that Randy Barnett thinks by a long shot, but it's a great example of a book. I mean, the book really is terrific, and there are reasons for it. I can give you concrete reasons for why his book has been so successful. But ultimately, the point is simply this. So he spent many, many years as a professor laboring away, writing book after book after book, and then he finally wrote this book. So I mean, you could see his own development as a thinker. He had support from all sorts of institutions, the Cato Institute and his interaction with Cato, the Institute for Justice, IHS. And again, my point here goes to the importance of institutions. But he wrote a book that now has really changed the way people look at judicial review. And it's a really good example of the enormous power of books in any kind of a movement. To the extent that I went to a Federalist Society talk years ago, right when this book came out. This was during the Bush administration. The Federalist Society is a legal organization, a kind of conservative legal organization. The Bush administration felt compelled to talk about Randy's book and to respond to it because it had had such an impact. Now, around this book now, if you look today, are all kinds of other scholars that are writing books about his book, because he's saying challenging things. People are writing books to criticize what he said. People are writing books to apply what he said. But the point ultimately is, with this book, he has sort of created a kind of mini movement. Now, if you go back in time, you can see that, of course, he didn't start this. He wasn't the first person to write about the issues that he was writing about. He was relying on other thinkers, one of whom was Richard Epstein. And then if you continue to go back, another thinker that Richard Epstein was relying on is a guy by the name of Bernard Segan, who was writing in the 1980s about economic liberties in the Constitution. I don't know how many people remember this, but Second Renaissance actually sold Bernard Segan's book. So you can trace the influence of Bernard Segan to people like Richard Epstein, to people like Randy Barnett, and then now there's a whole contingent of people who are writing about the same topic. That's what we need to be doing. And let me say that I rely on books that objectivists have written constantly, every day. I mean, not a day goes by that I don't crack open OPAR and reread a page that I've read about 3,000 times already. I've learned so much from Tara Smith's essays in the Mayhew collection on Atlas Shrugged, her essays on objective law. I mean, Yaron and Don's book, I told Don this not long ago about FMR. When I saw it come out, I thought, great book, but I already know all that, And then I read it and I thought, holy crap, there's all kinds of stuff in this book that I'd never even thought about. All kinds of important identifications, ways of stating points that we all even know in a different way that triggers you to think about things in a different way. So ultimately, the point being that books are absolutely essential, and an organization like ARI is absolutely essential. And there's no other organization like this one. So, we're it in terms of getting objectivist ideas out there.
Yeah, so while you guys are coming up to ask questions, I wanted to say a word about the slideshow that it's been displaying while we've been talking. A lot of those books you've probably seen or heard about, they're not all by people who are on ARI's staff, and that's deliberate. ARI's fostering of books takes many shapes and forms, and sometimes it's in the background. We support people with grants. Sometimes it's through the archives. Sometimes it's people we've trained. Sometimes it's all of the above. And sometimes it's people on our staff. And the other way in which these books vary, which is important, is the scope of topics. So if you were here for the earlier session on objectivism's role in explaining and changing the culture, Don, Steve, and I talked about our projects. And those projects are in the realm of cultural political issues, free speech, inequality, foreign policy. And as has already come out in the comments so far, we think it's important to write books on philosophy and academic books and scholarly books, so Tara's books and Rob Mayhew's collections. So the range of what we're referring to by books is wide, and it's really important to see that scope because all of those books are important, and some of them are much more important given their shelf life and their appeal and just the depth to which they go into an issue. So I wanted to just account for that. So.
Okay, this is an excellent and very important subject. I wanted to see if I can have you clarify or solve an apparent contradiction. At the beginning of this week, we spoke, or you spoke about what objectivism is, and that is basically the works of Ayn Rand, and that it is a closed system. But then there are already a lot of books written in addition to the works of Ayn Rand. And then now you're asking us, and we will write a lot more stuff. how do we, now some people argue that, well, this is not objectivism because it is not what Ayn Rand wrote. How do we reconcile those two positions? In other words, where does objectivism end and where something else starts? And also, how do you evaluate if a book that is supposedly written about objectivism really is objectivism, or it is really far off and somewhere else?
So let me take that, and it's a good question, and it's a question that because of the way objectivism defined has to come up, and it's important to address. Look, this is not objectivism. It's the application of objectivism. It's our interpretation of objectivism. Objectivism is what Ayn Rand wrote plus OPA. That's it. That's objectivism. What we do is take that and apply it. Now, if I thought Ayn Rand was wrong about something, and this comes to your second part of the question, I would then be very, very explicit about what I'm doing. I would say, this is not objectivism, but here's where I think she's wrong about this, and this is how I think this should be, and this is not objectivism, right? I would make that point. We don't do that in our books because we're not challenging Ayn Rand. We believe strongly, now you might disagree or somebody might disagree, but we believe that we're taking her ideas and applying them as is. We agree with her foundation and we're applying it. So this is all based on objectivism, right? But if I were writing a book in philosophy or I was writing a book in epistemology, let's say, I won't, I promise. I was writing a book in epistemology. And and she wrote an intro, so there's a lot to write about it. And I was writing kind of I would say explicitly, here's the principle that I think Ayn Rand and this is my expansion. I would be very explicit on what is Ayn Rand and what is not Ayn Rand, right? Again, because our books, particularly here, our books are not challenging anything she's doing or not explicitly taking a philosophical principle of hers and kind of expanding it into an area she didn't address. We're using objectivism, applying objectivism, but it is not objectivism. And this is crucial to keep in mind. So we could be wrong, and there could be disagreements. And you're not disagreeing about objectivism. So let's take foreign policy, where there is disagreement. There's disagreements in the movement about how to apply objectivism to foreign policy, not about objectivism. Right? Yeah. And that's important. And those are different types of disagreements. Mm-hmm. And we keep that line very clear. And I think it's important that we keep that line very clear. One of my criticisms of the other people is that they don't. They purposefully make that line blurry. And that, to me, is very deceptive.
Good point. Thank you.
My question's primarily for Don. You had said at the beginning when you had started developing an interest in objectivism and writing that you kind of shunned the idea of application of objectivism instead of dealing in its foundations. And sometimes I deal with the same issue if I'm writing or even if I'm speaking with other people. I will try and be as abstract as possible because I have this kind of fear that I'll become concrete bound and I'll become detached from principles. And then sometimes I think, am I becoming too involved in principles and then it's, floating and it's divorced from any actual real world application. And so what is the proper way that you have developed in terms of thinking about these issues, the way in which that you approach objectivism, that you approach applying a principle to real world issues?
Well, there's a short way and a long way to answer that. I'll give the short way. The short way is I'm a big believer in having mentors and models. And basically models are people who you think do well what you want to do, and you can kind of study and learn from it. And then mentors are basically the people who have done what you want to do and give you individualized feedback. I don't know that this is working for some reason. And who will give you Is there, let's see. Well,
there we go.
There it is.
All right,
Working.
cool. Who will give you individualized feedback. And so, the major thing you want to do is just spot what you think is done well and backwards engineer it as best you can, And then, if you can, find people who do it well and who will give you feedback. And that's kind of the short version. The other particular resources that, I mean, there's a lot of objectivist material on communication and on this issue of dealing with abstractions and the relationships to concretes. And a good place to start is we have the ARI campus and then the Objectivist Academic Center, where you can get the benefit of mentors and models by going through that process.
Yeah, I was just going to raise that. So that's one of the most common kinds of things we deal with in the OAC, the Objectivist Academic Center. And I assume I can still be heard. Sometimes I guest teach in the portion on communication, which covers writing and speaking. And this is what it goes to the core of how do you communicate a philosophic perspective on a concrete issue? Because what we care about in the world is this and this and this, it's people and stuff. Ideas are the means of understanding and so forth. So how do you do that? I mean, this is, Ayn Rand's written on this in The Art of Nonfiction, and we carry that forward in the Objectivist Academic Center. And I raise it because I think there's a more general purpose here beyond your interest, which we can talk about more if you're interested. Beyond the tips, and I think Don's advice as well is valuable, which is this speaks to another facet of what we do at the Institute that's important to building the movement, growing it, which is we spend a lot of time training people. The Objectivist Academic Center is a huge, huge investment. I learned a lot from working with Yaron as his assistant for many years, and with Onkar, who's our editor, who's senior editor. And he's the head of the OAC. He is the OAC for all intents and purposes for many years. And that work is not visible. I mean, it's the unseen, right, in economic terms. But that is the engine room, if you will. That is the motive power behind. I would not have been able to write anything at all interesting, I think, absent the time I spent training at the Institute, which started 20 years ago. So that's just to emphasize that a book is an outcome for which there's a long investment path.
So just quickly, I would say 2 courses on ARI and Ayn Rand campus that you should look at, because this is a common problem that we have as objectivists. You know, we tend to be up here, and it's hard to get down here. Understanding Objectivism is a crucial, crucial course. Everybody should listen to Understanding Objectivism, and it's free. You have no excuses. And the second one, also free, also on campus, is Objectivism through Induction. It's exactly this issue. How do we go from abstractions to concretes? But more importantly, how do we go to concretes to abstractions? And you have to be able to do that. And that movement has to become natural. You cannot debate people at the abstract level. You have to be able to bring it down to real world, and you have to take the real world and show them the abstractions. Now, we've got a long line, little time, so please, really short questions, and we'll try to have really short answers.
My question is regarding the state of publishing today. How difficult has it been to find publishers who are really interested in books applying objectivism, and do you have any kind of stories about that challenge, I guess?
Quickly, it's hard to find publishers. Don and I mean, lucky, and we've got a publisher that likes us and is willing to publish our books. But it's hard. The good side, the positive side of this is that it's so easy to self-publish today. Amazon makes it so easy to get a book out there quickly, effectively, so you can bypass the whole system and just get it out. Now, it's not optimal because you're not in Barnes & Noble, or it's harder to get into Barnes & Noble, but it's, you know, who buys books in Barnes & Noble?
I'm wondering if you guys can talk briefly about to what degree ARI writers and thinkers, you guys and everyone else, are attempting to interface with thinkers who aren't part of the objectivist movement.
I mean, I think that's a huge part of what we do. I mean, just to take the example with equals unfair, one of our major part of our focus has been who are the people who are influential for better and worse on this issue. Get the book in their hands, help them extract the ideas, build relationships with them. And you can even look at the endorsements on the book. Almost all of them are very influential people who are not objectivists. There's, I think, a couple objectivists there, at least one. But most of it is non-objectivist. And I think we can't be influential if we're not speaking to other influencers.
Yeah, and let me point out, Don did a podcast leading up to the publication of Equal is Unfair, really for a few years now, with Roosevelt Care and everything, where if he interviewed the most influential thinkers out there, libertarians, conservatives, generally kind of on what we consider the right. I mean, it was amazing. The kind of Charles Murray agreed to do an interview with Don, and a bunch of really, really influential people on an objectivist podcast, and they all agreed to do it, and that was an important way to do that. Elan and I on the foreign policy side have been interacting with non-objectivists, from Daniel Pipes to many, many others for years and years and years. An important way in which we learned about the world out there, about the latest thinking about the Middle East came from that. And then, of course, they learned about objectivism. So there's no question somebody like Daniel Pipes has a view of Ayn Rand and a view of objectivism. I mean, I don't think he was ever negative, but now it's way up here because, you know, he respects us, and he respects our point of view. He doesn't agree with everything we say. So it's really important to do that, and we try to do a lot of it.
One very quick data point. So this is a homework assignment for you. Did everyone here get a copy of Defending Free Speech? If you haven't, go get a copy. And then go read the endorsement by Harvey Silverglate. And if you don't know who he is, read the blurb underneath it. And then if you still aren't convinced he's someone interesting and important, Google him. Harvey Silverglate is a remarkably courageous man who was part of the ACLU. I don't think of him as part of the right in any conventional sense. And he wrote what I regard as one of the most glowing endorsements for Steve's book. And I mean, can I tell him about this? Yeah. He wrote 3 different blurbs, and he said, I could write more. Tell me if you want more.
Use the one you want.
Yeah, and email me if you want any. And I'm just doing that mainly because I think it illustrates that we think it's crucial to engage with the outside, and it's also crucial that I think we're having an effect. I mean, it's significant.
I mean, we've been in touch and communicating regularly and doing events regularly with Fleming Rose. Sorry, one of those. Fleming Rose since 2006. I mean, before anybody knew who he was. We were the first people to bring him to the United States to do panel discussions on free speech before anybody, right after the cartoons came out in Denmark. And now, you know, he's a big shot in the U.S., but we've been doing this forever because we're looking for the really good guys out there, for the people who really stand out, and we want to have these relationships because we can learn from them. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my question is about branding yourself. I'm writing a book on education, obviously, and I think it's important for me because to get kind of a brand out there through social media and blogging and all of that before I publish the book, and I just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
I'm going to go with the youngest member of
I don't think in those terms. I think in terms of that great intellectual Steve Martin, whose basic career advice was be so good they can't ignore you.
This is sort of a lighter question. To write the books that you do, you have to know everything or the main ideas in the field, which means you must have to read some abysmal crap. So, just for instance, what was it like to read Piketty?
That was not the worst.
No, Piketty's actually a fairly good writer, so and he tries to bring literature in, so it wasn't that bad.
I was on a summer vacation, and that was when I forced myself to go through Rawls's 600 pages of a theory of justice.
Yeah. I delegated that.
Yeah. But you know what? Let me say one thing. It's actually can be really fun because there's nothing more mentally challenging than taking somebody who's trying to embed you in a bad context and you work your way out. And you might have some leads from Ayn Rand, but you know, she didn't walk you through each step in a theory of justice. And I find it one of the most valuable activities. And I recommend to everybody in your own role, you don't have to go through Rawls, but if you want to be persuasive, stop saying Paul Krugman says nothing right. Read Paul Krugman and figure out where exactly he's going wrong, or whomever is in your field.
Yeah, I mean, years ago, and I mean, I find reading good stuff that I disagree with really fun and interesting and challenging. So I remember years ago, I made it an assignment for all the prospective intellectuals and intellectuals at the Institute to read one of Thomas Friedman's books. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do.
And these guys flipped out. We're not reading Thomas Friedman. This is all wrong. Why should we read it? And I said, no, there's something here really to learn. First of all, there's good stuff in the book. Secondly, you've got to learn how to deal with these issues and combat them. And we literally read, was it Flat Earth?
Yeah.
I think it was the Flat Earth. and discussed, I think, chapter by chapter. And I think it was valuable in the end, right?
Well, we didn't object because he had wrong ideas. We objected because he's an annoying writer.
Yeah, well.
I want to say one quick thing on that, which is, so I had the same experience, which is I have not found anything to be tiresome or offensively bad. And I've learned the most from reading people I disagree with, as a rule. And I've actually been dispirited when I read people that I go into thinking, these are going to be my allies. And I read some of their work, and I think, there's a lot to learn here about how not to say certain things, and things I just couldn't defend. I mean, I just don't agree with. And so I think none of this, and I think the premise is what I'm challenging, which is intellectual work requires just engaging with the issues and looking at it firsthand, and I don't find any of that off-putting. That's what gets me to geek out. What I think it's really important as well to have that orientation towards, well, what's out there? And some of it might not be pleasant, and there have been things that were slightly dull, but it's just, this is where the thrill is, to be, just to give a personal aspect to it.
If you'll indulge an observation that ties together something that Don said and something that Steve mentioned about technical books that small numbers being important, and Steve mentioned Bernard Segan sort of launching that large legal movement. In 2000, which was 20 years after he published Economic Liberty and the Constitution, I asked him how many had sold, and he said over those 20 years it was 2,500 books. And I would say every single influential person in the conservative libertarian legal movement has read and was inspired by that book.
Yeah. And I think there are lots of examples of that. How many, I mean, let's take the opposition. How many John Rawls' books have sold? Very few. He's changed the world for the worse, but he's changed the world. Those kind of books don't have to sell many copies at all.
In the previous session, Don, you said that statistics and studies are not a good way to influence people, or you said something about the appeal to that. At the same time, those don't seem like completely useless. So what's the role of that kind of facts and figures type stuff when you write a book?
It depends on the context, but like for an Equals Unfair, we definitely go through statistics and studies that are relevant to understanding not is capitalism good or not, but what has been happening over the last 30 or 40 years. And the key thing, the key difference, and this goes to the point I was making there about taking the methodological high ground, is that even when they're relevant, you can't just throw them out. You can't just say, there's been this much growth in wages, and then go home and take a nap. You have to be objective and help the reader understand what is speculative, what's established, what's debatable, what are other pieces of evidence that either back it up or don't. Otherwise, at best, it comes across as arbitrary because they have no way to process it. You give me a bunch of statistics, this guy gives me a bunch of statistics, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to pick the guy who tells me the conclusions that I already want to agree with. So you can, and I think there are areas where they're indispensable. You have to use them, but you just need to do it objectively, unsurprisingly.
One quick one. Any objectivism through induction? Any thoughts on turning that into a book like you did with some of the other courses?
I mean, remembering the course, I think it would be so difficult. I just think it would be very difficult. And I think that the kind of editing a book like that would almost require Leonard to do it, or Leonard Peikoff. That is such a work of, I mean, I think that's one of the, I think somebody said it the other day on stage. It's one of the most important things he ever did, and it's hard. And if you remember trying to do the exercises, they were hard, and I usually got it wrong. And so, but there's so many, but you also, there's so much optionality in it, right? There's no way, and he says this over and over again, there's no one path to induce. You can induce in many different ways, and indeed each one of us, to the extent that we've induced the principles, and hopefully to some extent you have, because that's what makes them real. We do it differently because we have different contexts. To put it in a book, I think would be difficult. But I haven't heard the course in a long time. It's something to consider doing. But yeah, I mean, one of the biggest demands we get, the biggest request we've always got over the years is we want the courses in book form. That's why Understanding Objective, all the courses are slowly becoming books as well. So maybe, who knows. So yeah, this will be the last question.
Okay, so I'm going to be starting a Strive Club on my campus this fall. And I'm kind of curious to hear what you guys all think. What a good book would be to start people off, show people what the philosophy is, because some of my friends don't like reading that much or whatever. And you try to hand them a copy of Atlas Shrugged, they're probably, I don't know, use it as toilet paper or something. So.
Do you like watching stuff?
Do I like watching stuff?
Do they like watching stuff on YouTube?
Yeah.
Well, we have a YouTube channel. And it's full of content. And it's however much time you have, there's content to fill it. And you could sit there for hours.
And each one of those could be turned into a great philosophical discussion. I mean, I think Don and my book, Free Market Revolution, if they're interested in the kind of the more economic side, is a good intro because it covers morality and it doesn't deal directly with epistemology, but the way in which we deal with certain issues is a very much, a reasoned approach, an epistemological approach. But start with, what I would do, right, is I would start with the virtue of selfishness of capitalism, not an ideal, and I'd do an essay a month, right? Don't do too much demand on them, right? They don't like to read. But you could take the essay on what is capitalism, and it's a dense essay, and it's a hard essay, and you need to read it slowly, and you need to really think about it. So take a month and take a few sessions where you're meeting just to talk about that one essay, and then take the Objectivist ethics, and wow, that could take a month just to chew it and discuss it. So I don't think you have to read a full book when it comes to Ayn Rand because her essays there's so much content there. So I would take either one of those essay collections and then read all the essays because all the essays then chew the original essay, right? The original essay. So,
thanks.
Sure. So I'd like to just end on this note. One of the things that these guys mentioned that is the value of kind of being at ARI and there being a little group at ARI. And it reminded me of the fact that, we're not unique in that sense. If you think about the Chicago School of Economics, why is it called the Chicago School of Economics? Because Milton Friedman, actually, there were people who preceded Milton Friedman, a certain approach to economics, and they all gravitated, because Milton Friedman was there, to Chicago, so they could all work together, edit each other, stimulate each other, talk in the corridor with each other, and develop the Chicago School of Economics. If you look about the best work in Austrian economics today, it's coming out of George Mason University, one university where everybody is an Austrian. They hire people, and they all stimulate each other, and they talk to each other, and they're writing books and they're editing each other, and it works that way. And why think tanks work so well is because they're doing the same thing. We're not a think tank, right? We're here to apply a philosophy, to write about philosophy as it applies to fill in the blank. And it could be policy issues, but it could be a variety of different issues. It depends on what kind of scholars, what kind of intellectuals we can hire and we can bring in, right? So there's enormous value in creating centers. And if you look at every intellectual movement out there today, public choice, where would public choice be in law if not for the George Mason Law School and the idea of bringing all these people together all in one place? Every one of them has a center. Now, in some respects, the ideal would be if Objectivism had its center at a university. That gives you more prestige. But we don't. We want to. We're working on it. We're going to make it happen. But we don't yet. This is the center. This is where it is. And this is where you come in, helping us create this center. You help us make this happen, make it possible us to hire amazing people like we have around on the stage right now and to train them and to bring in new people and to build a school, an objectivist, like the Chicago school, like the Austrian school, like the objectivist school, right? Where we produce ongoing, steady streams of content that illustrate what objectivism really means in man's life. And that's what the culture needs, and that is, in my view, the only way ultimately the culture will change. All right. Thank you, guys.